In this series of videos, we'll be discussing an organization that isn't really a financial institution, but plays a lot of the same sort of economic roles that a financial institution does. And this is the state. The reason that I say that a state behaves like a financial institution is because, like many of the organizations we've been discussing over the prior lessons, you'll note that states acquire a large number of resources from a large number of people and then invest this into large-scale projects, hopefully for the purpose of generating some sort of economic gain. Now, one of the major distinctions between a state and a financial institution is that participation in the state's, footprint of your life is not always voluntary. Whereas you might choose to be the customer of a particular corporation or to lend your money to a particular bank, you don't often have the opportunity to decide whether or not you're going to pay your taxes. You might be able to opt out of the benefit side of the state by refusing to draw on certain opportunities you have, but you certainly don't have the ability to simply decide that you're not going to pay in the way that you could, for instance, decide not to contribute to a pension plan or could decide simply to not buy insurance. Now, the main objectives of government finances or state finances are the allocation of our resources to public goods and the redistribution of wealth within society. For those without an economic background, public goods are generally those that we refer to as social infrastructure, things like hospitals that are publicly available, public schools, courts, fire departments, police services, other sorts of organizations like this that don't necessarily generate profit, but that people in society either feel are required or they have significant demand for it. Now, in the same way that some public goods are hard to generate or hard to estimate the value of, hard to put a dollar value on, say, having access to a court or a police department, but we should also think about redistribution of wealth in the same way. There are gains from redistribution that are necessarily hard to quantify. These often manifest in a form of social stability that can help to reduce the costs of other kinds of social programs, like, for instance, police, if we are able to address people's needs in some other way. Now, to understand the structure of the state, it's worth going back to take a look at how this all began. Taking a look at early human cultures, anthropologically speaking, nomadic cultures tend to develop decentralized economic systems that tend towards more heavily leaning into commodity payments. These sorts of nomadic civilizations are usually comprised of smaller social units that tend to emphasize the allocation of resources through gifting and collective ownership. Now, one of the interesting notes in this regard comes from a quote on early Canadian civilizations. And in this, Dickinson and McNabb note that, quote, the power of chiefs depended on their capacity to provide for their followers, as well as their powers of persuasion. Instead of gaining power through their positions, they could actually end up being the poorest in a group because of the continual demands made on their resources. Now, this type of pattern is not only prevalent in North American indigenous cultures, but we also see it in the nomadic cultures of people on the Eurasian steppe. Going as far back as the Yamana people to the Tochar people, we see very similar patterns developing, particularly the pattern where the leadership of a small group relies on one's ability to personally provide for the loyal cadre of companions, what was sometimes referred to as a comitatus by Roman commentators who were remarking on the personal charisma of some of the nomadic leaders that they were obviously encountering and having challenges to deal with. Now, usually speaking, when we talk about the formation of a state, and of course the basis of this, we have to understand is the need for coordination. If there is a low need for coordination, then there really isn't a lot of impetus for us to get together and actually form a state unit to resolve disputes and allocate resources towards some kind of common good. In fact, historically speaking, farmers don't necessarily develop states unless they're actually required for food stability. So in regions, for instance, like Canada's Great Lakes regions, where we had a variety of food options available for early agriculturalists, we don't actually see state development taking place. But in regions like Mesopotamia or in the Nile region, or even in the early Ganges and Indus valleys, one of the things we'll note is that state formation begins largely with the process of supporting irrigation. So in situations where the geography was permissive enough for large-scale agriculture, but unfortunately tended towards irrigation and monoculturing, In many situations, we ended up seeing the state develop as an institution simply to be able to help coordinate the efforts of all of the people that would be necessary. Now, one of the problems that we run into, of course, as I identified just now, is the state's span of control, which of course is informed by the geography that it occupies, and necessarily sets limits on the information flow within a particular space. Even once an early agricultural society can generate sufficient surpluses and then begin to invest it, there are real challenges with the span of control that necessarily comes from this. It's very challenging in the Bronze Age, for instance, for early leaders, early allocators, whether these be in temple or state-based economies, to really understand what's going on beyond the horizon, let alone to have their particular will enforced. An old Chinese saying captures this very, very well. So the saying is that the mountains are high and the emperor is far away, implying that given the physical challenges of information flowing, the locals are pretty much going to end up doing what they want, pointing to the fact that while geography may create hard barriers to protect us from invaders, internally riven geography can actually make it very, very hard for a nation to communicate. Now, in an early agricultural state, the only sources of value really are land and labor. These are the only meaningful and accessible assets. So strictly speaking, when we talk about gathering up resources from our society, we're necessarily talking about taxing land and labor, because these are the only really visible assets that we have and the only things that can be reasonably assessed. Now, of course, one of the key ways that people paid their taxes in the past was simply by donating some of their, well, donating is probably the wrong word, but contributing some of their labor. For instance, if we take a look in early palace and temple economies in Samaria, for instance, craftsmen were required to remit as much as 50% of their output to the temple or palace economy for redistribution within society. Now, noting the parallels between palace and temple economies, I should point out that many states, to develop the sort of early legitimacy that would be necessary to have people voluntarily hand over their output for redistribution, tended to associate themselves with religious authorities. Now, the main reason for this is because religious authorities in the age of cities and agriculture tended to be moral authorities as well. And so the implication was that if the rulers had moral authority, then they would be deserving of obedience. And that made it a lot easier to allocate people's efforts simply by authoritative fiat. So this is a particular challenge for us later as we begin to realize that religion, while it can be particularly sticky for everyone who is part of the in-group, say in a Sumerian city-state, can also lead to significant challenges for the state by automatically putting us at variance with those who follow other religions nearby. And so this is a very significant challenge for us that we've had to deal with for thousands of years. The notion that any sort of strong affiliation that really brings people together, at the same time, others people in such a way that we may actually end up frictioning them and decreasing our ability to coordinate with people who aren't directly affiliated with us via something like religion. Now, of course, for a state to be able to engage in any kind of reallocative efforts, they need information and they need a bureaucracy to implement those plans. Now, along the way, there are certain standardized tools. You'll note that in early states, we tend to develop common units of weight and measures, mostly so that we can engage in payments with strangers. Writing clearly helps with this sort of allocation, and quantification gives us the precision that we need to be able to deal with people who we aren't necessarily going to deal with in the future. But nonetheless, simply organizing the bureaucracy of the state is an incredibly trying task. It can be difficult for people to try to organize effort within, say, a school work group or within a household, but trying to organize the efforts of thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands of people at the state level can be a real challenge. Now, one of the earliest texts we see that offers advice to people running a state on how to allocate resources and what sort of aspects of the bureaucracy are necessary to create is China's Guanzi, that started appeared out of the Shandong Peninsula around the 4th century BCE. It describes in great detail the functions of government and provides an early discussion of certain macroeconomic themes that reemerge nearly 2,000 years later in the West, things like the quantity theory of money and basic notions of supply and demand. In India, a few centuries later, Kautilya produces what was called the Arthashastra, or the sort of Gospel of Wealth, which is a manual on kingship, which also describes in great detail exactly what sort of bureaucracy is necessary to support the state, down to the number of elephant trainers necessary to support particular military formations. But like any kind of bureaucracy, especially the ones we've been discussing earlier in the course with financial institutions, the principal agent problem manifests as well in state bureaucracies. And this is a particular challenge for us because of the scale at which state bureaucracies operate. The challenge ultimately is to try to make sure that the allocators who have discretion within the bureaucracy aren't doing so in their best interest, but rather are doing so in the interests of those who are providing the resources. Now, Goetzmann describes a little bit in his text how Chinese empire went about developing systems to help maintain that sort of bureaucracy. During the Zhou dynasty period, from about 1000 BC to 221 BC and the rise of the Han, we see a couple of major themes emerge in imperial China, notably Confucianism, which stressed right action and thought by everyone in the government, and legalism, which enforces strict control through harsh punishments. Needless to say, there have been a variety of different models that we've used for trying to determine what is the best shape of the state that provides at once the greatest amount of legitimacy to encourage people to continue providing resources and actively and efficiently allocates those resources to the projects necessary to build a great society. Now, through their taxing, spending, and investment activities, governments or states tend to be the largest single economic actor in their national economies, giving them the ability to influence the overall aggregate level of demand within society, either by taxing or drawing funds away from other sectors that might spend them, or spending its own wealth. But ultimately, the effectiveness of such policies of taxing and spending is driven by a state's awareness of its macroeconomic situation. So even though we got some of the earliest beginnings of how to create a state coming to us courtesy of Sumerian, Chinese, Indian, and other such early authorities, one of the things that was necessary ultimately to be able to administer large states were things like maps and censuses. The maps that turned out to be particularly important, not simply so that we knew where to march our militaries to be able to go in and take people's goods, but to be able to assess the productivity of lands post-conquest so that we would know approximately what its productivity would be and thereby reasonably allocate the burden of taxation across productive units in society. One of the earliest recorded monarchs we know doing this is Persian Emperor Darius I, around 500 BC. He levied taxes on the various Persian satraps or subordinate provinces of the empire according to their productivity. Now, the information used to settle such assessments tended to be old and outdated, but the effort nonetheless was made as opposed to simply assuming that all regions or all people ought to be necessarily assessed evenly. This technique was later ultimately used by William the Conqueror, who came over and conquered England in 1066. 20 years later, he performed an assessment of the island through what was known as the Domesday Book, which was ultimately used to assess taxes of private assets that were the hardest to conceal, i.e. land. The Domesday Book was in fact a land registry, making note of who had what title to what lands, and therefore who was required to pay what taxes to the monarch. Similarly, if we take a look at how the Mughal Empire organized itself, just prior to the rise of the Mughal Empire itself, Todar Mal, who had been a particularly high official within the Delhi court, was retained, and he performed a broad-scale assessment of the entire empire into a little over 3,300 parganas, which interestingly enough was maintained as the basic unit of tax assessment until the British completed their conquest of the area around 1793. So it's worth noting that it has been important throughout history for states to have a broad awareness of exactly how productive the lands under their control are and exactly how productive the people under their control are, so that they can properly allocate the burden of the state to those who will ultimately be benefiting from it as well. Of course, the biggest challenge to implementing any kind of policy that's designed to smooth fluctuations in economic conditions is the lag between detection and implementation. Today, some of our states have very sophisticated statistical agencies like Stats Canada, for instance, or Federal Reserve economic research departments, which provide a high level of information and granular information to state economists who can then use this to try to direct or formulate policies to have the intended effects. Needless to say, we've come a long way since the days of Darius's census, but we still have a great deal of work to do in trying to understand exactly how the economy functions and exactly what role the state can play most productively in its allocation.